Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is June 14, 2021, and in this video we are going to do the comments on the Hakim-Richard Wolff Conversation that we've been talking about for a few weeks now, and we have done a number of videos leading up to that. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So as I mentioned, I have done a number of videos in this series. I think it started with the comments on the Richard Wolff versus Destiny quote debate, really a whole event that never should have happened in my opinion. Very long video, I think about 3.5 hours. From there, we got into the topic of cooperatives and socialism, cooperatives and capitalism. I did some articles from Richard Wolff's recommended reading list on Titoism. And I've also dug up a reading from Enver Hoxha of Albania criticizing Titoism, actually kind of ripping it to shreds. So with all that as background, I want to head now into, I don't know how long this video will be, maybe an hour and a half, finishing off the Understanding Richard Wolff series for the time being. I can envision a future section of this in which I get into Richard Wolff's books a little bit more. But basically, you have a guy, Richard Wolff, who is a longtime labor studies professor, econ professor, very well educated, has been doing this for decades, knows what he's doing, and purports to be a champion of socialism. Yet I think is incredibly murky, incredibly unclear when talking about certain particulars. Tends to be real good at Socialism 101. However, for those of us who are way beyond that at this point, I find him inconsistent, or if he doesn't actually contradict himself, he is very selective on what he chooses to mention within a particular conversation. So something that happens a lot when I criticize Richard Wolff is somebody will pop up in the comments and say, oh, he actually addressed that in this one video. And my response to that is basically, well, okay, but how many people watched that one video versus how many people watched 3 or 4 lectures of his or interviews or whatever, because he does a lot of appearances, and they didn't get that takeaway, or they got something that seemed to at least to suggest the contrary, or was just much more basic, at least if it didn't contradict it. So that's kind of the criticism, is maybe he has mentioned something somewhere, which is pretty important, fundamental as far as we, socialists, not people trying to learn the basics of socialism, but people who already have learned the basics. We could use some leadership. Richard Wolff is an elder, but what's been the thing of the Western left? Revisionism, it's just selling out, basically. I mean, we've had real problems in the Western left basically since forever. There's never really been a revolutionary movement. I would count maybe the early IWW, in the 1905, 19 teens, something like that. It's been a real long time since the Cold Wars, something like that. Real militant situation. I don't mean to downplay pockets of, real resistance and struggle here and there. But particularly in the last 30, 40 years, we've witnessed with the demise of the USSR, that brought down so much of the momentum of, any kind of Western socialism, such as it was. And we have just not seen good leadership. We consequently have seen real misery spreading. Capitalism just, running roughshod. It's. I don't need to tell you, if you're living through 2021 right now, how bad things have gotten. They're awful. Housing is a crisis. Medical care is a crisis. And they're just beginning to tinker with these things inside the halls of power. We need more change. So anyway, that's the criticism, is like, what's the holdup? What are you waiting for? Let's do this. Let's get people educated. So we are in this video going to look at 2 things from Richard Wolff's website, and then we're going to get into the Hakim-Richard Wolff Conversation. I didn't want to make a separate video for these 2 articles or information points, but I did want to do them before we do the Hakim interview. So first thing, Richard Wolff's Marxist reading list. Yes, he has one. It's 5 or 6 pages in PDF. It was posted July 2019. And so it has quite a few entries. Some of them I personally find kind of random, but that's really neither here nor there. I bring up this list mainly just to show that, I mean, I think that Richard Wolff has strong, he calls himself Marxist or Marxian, whatever. I think that he has strong anarchist inclinations that he doesn't entirely own up to. We can get into that later. I mean, I've mentioned that in other videos. But basically, looking at this list, we see a number of sections. The first section here, Section A, the first theoretical generation after Marx and Engels. He is citing Hilferding, Lenin, Plekhanov, Luxemburg, Kautsky, Bernstein, like Engels, big names. Although I guess Engels is, not exactly the first generation after Engels. Anyway, Section B, Marxism and the Consequences of Soviet Power, citing Stalin, Trotsky, Bukharin, on and on. So, and it goes on into Gramsci, Horkheimer. Then there's World War II and after, the proliferation of many Marxisms, citing Mao and Sartre. Anyway, it's an extensive list. And the point here, why I've brought this up, is I'm assuming if Wolff is recommending these writings to other people, he has read them. He knows what opportunism is. He knows what revisionism is. He's aware of these discussions. And I think, for example, in his constant dodging of the question of revolution, he is engaging in exactly what Lenin would call revisionist behavior without, criticizing it as such or explaining why it's okay though, really, or, whatever it is. But he's aware of the discussions that you and I have, that the things that we do on this channel and the kind of conversations in the comments, my understanding of Marxism and yours, Wolff shares this. However, he is, playing in the DSA pool and, I'm all for outreach. No doubt. But let's try to actually teach people the real shit. I mean, why hold back? And more than why hold back, why put out revisionist views that, without at least saying now, any Marxist-Leninist would call this revisionist, which means X, etc. In other words, you can talk to different levels of people, different level of student at the same time. That's entirely possible. You can put out large concepts while telling some listeners, if you don't know what that means, hang on, we'll cover it later, while throwing out, a little bookmark for people to come back to it. And it's really not that hard, to be honest. I think that for the amount that Richard Wolff talks, he does regular videos and he's doing interviews constantly. I think that not doing this at this point is irresponsible. We need to teach people real Marxism. Otherwise, you're just going to wind up with more DSA type stuff. I don't necessarily think working with DSA is always bad. They need to stop endorsing Democrats. And, at this point, whatever sticks, whatever works, like wherever we can get some traction, fine. But let's at least try to, teach some history and not make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And part of the way that we do that is teaching people real history. So, okay, the Marxist reading list out of the way, mainly just for the point that Wolff knows this stuff. And, yet I don't think he sticks to it in practice. Now, the next thing I want to look at is an article that Wolff did. It's up on his website, Socialism and Workers' Co-ops, originally published in Counterpunch on May 10, 2019. So this is pretty recent. And I felt like this article sums up Richard Wolff's positions pretty clearly. So it's just a couple of pages long. I'm going to read it, explain why I think that this, Richard Wolff is putting himself out there. He's one of the most outspoken proponents of, quote, Marxism, and is really making the rounds on every little left channel that he can do. And What is he actually spreading, though, I guess is the question. Is it really grounded in Marxism, Leninism, or, what is it? He has this recommended reading list out here. Why recommend that people read all these things if you're not going to follow it or if you're going to directly contradict it? Okay, so Socialism and Workers' Co-ops by Richard D. Wolff, May 10, 2019. I'm going to read this all the way through. We'll analyze, and then we'll move on to the Hakim thing. Actually existing socialisms since the 1917 Soviet Revolution leave a rich legacy. Aspects to build on, aspects to reject. Collective consumption, free education, medical care, subsidized housing, transport, etc., is among the first, and party dictatorship is among the second. Those socialism's complex histories also leave a legacy of what went missing from them. Identifying and evaluating missing elements can provide today's socialist movements with better means to surpass capitalism than earlier socialist movements had. Traditional socialisms stressed macro-level social changes. They promoted socialized over private property in means of production, socially planned distribution of resources and products, rather than distribution via market exchange. They abandoned some limited efforts at democratizing enterprise structures relatively early and reverted to the employer-employee model of enterprise organization. The early ideas of socialism that had sometimes included democratized or cooperativized enterprises gave way to a concept of socialism that adopted the employer-employee structure as somehow necessary and universal. Thus, what went missing in most actually existing socialisms was a genuinely socialized enterprise as the economic foundation of production and distribution. Those of us banging the drums for a recognition of the importance of promoting and building democratic worker co-ops are motivated in part by the need to respond to what was missing before. We seek to add a dimension that was absent, not to displace the positive achievements of both the actually existing socialisms and the social movements seeking transitions beyond capitalism. Indeed, we are motivated by the further belief that some of the negative aspects of actually existing socialisms were consequences of what was missing from them. That makes it doubly important to identify and supply what was missing. Worker cooperatives, where workers organize, manage, and direct their workplace division of labor democratically, have a history almost as old as the human race. They represent a stark alternative to the undemocratic, hierarchical organization of past enterprises, such as the slave and feudal, with their master-slave and lord-serf divisions. Worker co-ops likewise differ from capitalist enterprises' foundational division between employees and employers. Worker co-ops make each worker both an individual wage earner and an equal member of the collective of workers functioning as the employer, as in a corporate board of directors. They thus require and develop within each worker abilities, tastes, and demands for participation in all workplace decisions, and likely at other sites in society as well. Thereby, economic power devolves from its capitalist concentration in the minority at the top, owners and directors, of enterprises downward to the democratic collective of all workers. Worker co-ops convert workplaces into genuine democratic communities, something capitalist enterprises could only ever pretend to support elsewhere in society. As the democratic worker base of a social economy built on cooperatives, such worker-directed enterprises could go far in remedying the democratic deficiencies of party, state, and society in actually existing socialisms. In such a social economy based on worker cooperatives, the state would no longer be subject to the conflicting influences of employers versus employees. It would not enforce the rule of employers over employees as it normally did in capitalism. Instead, its chief goal would be to reproduce the worker cooperative organization of enterprises. To that end, it would coordinate relationships among worker co-ops, individual workers, and individual consumers. Democratically representative of both regular workplace and residence place assemblies, the state would develop long and short-term development plans, and arbitrate disputes among enterprises and individuals. Projects democratically decided that exceeded individual worker co-ops' capacities would be managed by the state. Regular assembly, majority decision, recall, and associated measures to ensure democratic decision-making would be part of the constitution of such a worker cooperative-based social economy. Worker co-ops offer even greater potential to strengthen socialist political parties working inside capitalist societies to move beyond them. In addition to providing an attractive vision of a cooperative society, worker co-ops could give such socialist parties a strong economic and political base. First, making the transition to worker co-ops a central part of socialist objectives brings the reality of socialism to the immediate micro level of every working person's daily life on the job. Socialism is then no longer a matter of changing from private to government ownership, from market to planning, and other such macro-level changes, quite removed from individual workers' daily lives. A worker co-op organization of factories, offices, and stores will alter every aspect of workplace life and relationships, making new demands while offering new responsibilities and powers to most workers. Workers' engagements with socialism will thus involve a daily process of building, safeguarding, and reproducing the democratic cooperative organization of their workplaces, and thereby transforming themselves. It makes socialism immediately relevant and powerful in an ongoing way. It also makes the prospect of socialism an exciting draw that every working person can understand and relate to. Such an engaging socialist vision is what contemporary socialist parties have lacked for a long time. Second, the enemies of socialism are unprepared, for such a socialist vision. They have spent the last century honing their adversarial skills against the state's macroeconomic intervention, state enterprises, state central planning, etc. That was how they understood what socialism was, so they became endless celebrants of private enterprise and, quote, free markets. They're poorly equipped to handle a socialist assault focused less on the macro and more on the micro dimensions. To take a simple example, how well will they defend against socialists' attacks on the patently undemocratic organization of the capitalist enterprise, virtually dictatorial powers of a small minority of owners, boards of directors, etc., over a majority of employees affected by, but excluded from, all the basic business decisions? Third, a socialist political party and worker co-ops are natural allies and partners. The party needs widely dispersed local bases to support, identify, and mobilize activists, raise funds, etc. The worker co-ops need a political organization strong enough to advance the worker co-op sector of the economy. To that end, a socialist party can work for new or revised laws and regulations, repeal of old ones, etc. Capitalistically organized enterprises have long used political parties, Republicans and Democrats in the United States, to advance their interests. Their alliance is the establishment. An alliance of worker co-ops and a socialist party is needed to secure and grow both within societies whose establishments will resist that. So that's the end of the audiobook, and there are a few ways that we can analyze this article. Actually, this seems to have been produced in part for classroom use, so Wolff has actually included 4 suggested discussion questions, which I think also are instructive as far as what his train of thought was here. Before we get to those, and I will read them, I think I'm just going to go through the article again, commenting on some of the major points. So the first thing that Wolff mentions is that actually existing socialisms since the USSR have emphasized free education, medical care, housing, transport as kind of the first thing, and then the party dictatorship, well, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the vehicle for which is the party, I would try to clarify there. So he makes this point of that, quote, traditional socialisms stressed macro-level social changes. So they were socializing the, big national infrastructure and the essentials of life, decommodifying those, bringing them under control of the working class through the party. and they emphasized socially planned distribution of resources and products rather than market exchange. So let's go with that first. Why did they do that? That's not one of Wolff's questions. It's one of mine. Why did they do that? Well, the basic idea of Marxist-Leninist thought is confrontation, revolutionary confrontation with capital. The more power you leave capital with as you try to build your new society, the more power they have to come at you and to try to tear down what you're trying to build, because they know that what we're trying to build is an effort to replace what they have, their society of exploitation, which may have been a step up over feudalism in some ways, but is painfully incomplete as far as the liberation of humanity, and is based on exploitation. So the idea is a revolutionary confrontation with capital, neutralizing capital, and then to whatever extent you can't neutralize it, suppressing capital for as long as it takes until you can extinguish it. Naturally, by this logic, which stems out of how power is organized under capitalism, that's what we're trying to change. Therefore, that's what we need to address. Naturally, this is based around decommodifying the ways in which capitalists hold us hostage most painfully, denying healthcare, housing, education, all these things. If you are able to liberate those things from capital, give them to the working class, you can achieve rapid progress, and then a working class which is not so vulnerable. So Wolff doesn't mention that at all. He's just like, well, one way is top down. Another way is we could go bottom up. I'll come back to his contention about the limited efforts at democratizing enterprise structures were abandoned relatively early. However, he goes on then to worker cooperatives, and he also asserts that some of the negative aspects of actually existing socialisms were consequences of what was missing from them. This is merely Wolff's assertion. He doesn't develop it with evidence. He does not develop it with examples. And actually, I will mention now. He says, quote, referring to the Soviet and similar earlier started systems, they abandoned some limited efforts at democratizing enterprise structures relatively early and reverted to the employer-employee model of enterprise organization. Continuing, thus what went missing in most actually existing socialisms was a genuinely socialized enterprise as the economic foundation of production and distribution. Okay. So this is the setup that he's contrasting by saying those of us banging the drums for a recognition of the importance of promoting and building democratic worker co-ops is motivated in part by the need to respond to what was missing before. First of all, this is not actually correct. I have an article, perhaps I will do it at some point. I considered doing it before this video, and then I just wanted to get this video done. But there is an article about workplace democracy in the USSR, particularly the earlier USSR, under Stalin, for example. And it may have been more democratic than Western propaganda said. Imagine that. I'm not saying it was all cooperatives, but also, we don't have great records of some of the stuff. But from what we have found, it may actually have been a lot more democratic than people assume. So this entire contention may not be really that stable a base or, solid a base for, making this claim, which is more or less the fundamental premise of this article. I really would expect more from a labor studies professor and econ professor as well educated as Wolff. However, it is fairly typical anarchist type criticism. If it's not totally horizontal, if it is not, full communism immediately, it's, no good, and you're doing something wrong in their eyes. How about it's possible that the entire time everybody was trying to figure out, how do we make all of this property truly social? Well, the view in the The prevailing view in the Marxist-Leninist parties of the time was that state ownership was the highest level of social ownership that could be achieved at that time. This is, if you go back to the audiobooks we did on Titoism, and particularly Hoxha criticizing Titoism, which is this sort of market-based cooperative thing, he slams that because the prevailing view was state property was the highest form of social property that they could do. There were discussions about possible future transitions to something else, but there was a reason they did it that way, because anything else was to revert to capitalism and to fall back under the influence of the still very strong imperialist powers. That's just functionally what would happen if you did that at that point. So there were reasons for that, none of which Wolff addresses, but I'm sure he is familiar with, given his education. Why? Again, just seems very anarchist, seems very ideological, seems very utopian as well. So moving on through the article, he details, what worker cooperatives are, etc. And then he goes back to the employer-employee relationship, which he says that his version of cooperatives neutralizes. Perhaps it does at a micro level. The bigger question is, in that, okay, you have employers or employees, owners or workers in a traditional capitalist business. However, in a worker cooperative, you have worker owners, worker-owners, where you are both a worker and an owner. There isn't a separate parasite class within that institution. However, is this a model for changing society from the ground up? Is that possible? Or is this a revisionist lie intended to get us away from considering revolutionary confrontation with capital? That's pretty much always been my problem with Richard Wolff. But he goes on to talk about how this would fit within a socialist society. So I'll quote again. Instead, its chief goal, rather than enforcing the rule of employers over employees, this is on the role of the state at this point. Its chief goal would be to reproduce the worker cooperative organization of enterprises. To that end, it would coordinate relationships among worker co-ops, individual workers, and individual consumers. Democratically representative of both regular workplace and residence place assemblies, the state would develop long and short-term development plans and arbitrate disputes among enterprises and individuals. Projects democratically decided that exceeded individual worker co-ops' capacities would be managed by the state. Regular assembly, majority decision, recall, and associated measures to ensure democratic processes, etc., etc. Okay, so let's go back to Titoism. In the early years of the Titoist project, they had co-ops in name, but state planning and practice. And what they found was that it's kind of either or. You can say you have co-ops, but if all they're doing is implementing a state plan, you don't really have co-ops or decentralization or whatever. And then when you do have the decentralization, which they progressively, with time, did introduce more and more, you wind up with basically capitalism light. And that's exactly what happened. That's why Hoxha called his pamphlet Yugoslav Self-Administration, a Capitalist Theory and Practice. And he went into a lot of detail about that, which Wolff is conveniently ignoring. I can only assume for some kind of ideological reasons here, because there certainly is evidence of it. I got the Titoism list from Richard Wolff. Just like he had the Marxism list, he had a list of 5 suggested Tito readings. So, yeah. Anyway, he goes on, and I'll try to wrap this up. Making the transition to worker co-ops a central part of socialist objectives brings the reality of socialism to the immediate micro level of every working person's daily life on the job. So anyway, this is, I've addressed this in other videos. It's extremely hard to start a co-op. Starting one from the ground up, you need a huge amount of capital, first of all, like starting any business, really, that's actually going to be able to pay your bills. You need capital. And also, it's nice to say, hey, we're going to do a co-op. try actually finding three or four people who have the skills to do the job and the skills to cooperate on that level. Try it. Part of the reason we need the state and the party is to re-socialize people. We've been socialized to just hate each other and compete with each other and think of ourselves and adopt a bourgeois mindset. I have found from my own experience in a co-op, most people really aren't ready for it. And we found ourselves taking on people who were ideologically committed to cooperatives more than, they had an ability to do the skills of the job. In other words, we found it easier to teach people the skills of the job than it was to teach people the skills of cooperation. That's how difficult it is. So this is, again, I think it's utopian, and it also it tries to sweep away everything that early efforts at socialism like the Soviet Union did as, just what they did was ideological rather than practical. Like, rather than saying they tried a bunch of stuff and they realized immediately why some of it wouldn't work and they had to build, I'm not saying that they didn't make mistakes, because they did, but that overall the guiding path was, what can we actually do with the situation in front of us? Did they always do it perfectly? No, but that was the guiding principle. I know also for the co-op, we did what we could. We had to keep the lights on. We were really trying to build a co-op that ran not just on a majority of, we didn't want to do wage labor. We wanted all members working. And with the exception of some seasonal employees, people you'd bring on temporarily, that members really couldn't do it without working like 80 hours a week or something. But that those positions just literally, a need for them did not exist year round. We were able to achieve like 80-90% labor by members. So we were really strict about that. But it was super difficult, and we were constantly facing hardship because of it. It's just not as easy as, oh, I understand the logic of cooperatives. Therefore, and that's all there is to it. Therefore, I can do this in reality. No, you immediately come up against material realities that you just simply have no control over, and you just have to do what you can within the parameters of what you're dealing with. So that's not addressed at all. This is so superficial. It's you know what it is? It's pure ideology. That's what it is. So also this point about the enemies of socialism are unprepared for such a socialist vision. Yeah, maybe because it won't work. They're prepared for actual threats to their power. Like, collectivizing housing and other major, like, desperately needed things. They don't really care if you build a few co-ops at all. In fact, within bourgeois law, there are even like ways to set up co-ops. It's not a threat. And believe me, if it ever became a threat, just like with labor unions, they would find some way to make it illegal or something. There's no way around that revolutionary confrontation. So I think this article, aside from teaching in a misleadingly rosy and optimistic way the logic of what a co-op is, while also shitting on, traditional Marxist-Leninist efforts at socialism without really backing any of that shit up. It's just kind of empty. It's kind of fluff. But people get sucked in by this, and then they're like, no, Tanky, we can do co-ops because Richard Wolff said so. Kind of lying through his teeth, I think. The question is why, Is he all bad? Is it malicious? I don't know. But I can tell you that what he's saying here doesn't add up. It's kind of just sounds like something an anarchist would say. And it's no good. People, to the extent that people follow this, they're being misled, and their time and effort will be wasted. I feel like mine largely was, back in my brief, anarchist flavored phase when I actually was in a co-op. That's part of why I did this channel, because I was like, I saw quickly how hollow that was. And I was like, we need to totally overhaul society. This isn't going to work. why doesn't Richard Wolff know that? So anyway, I am going to skip the questions, like I said, that are suggested discussion questions. You can read that on your own. The link to this article and the links to the reading lists are in the video description. Okay, all of that said, I guess, let's get to the Hakim conversation. I will play the video in my usual style and just pause it occasionally to comment on what is happening.
Hello, Professor. I'm sure that everyone joining me knows who you are, but just in case you don't, this is Professor Richard D. Wolff. He is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show Economic Update, which I highly recommend you watch. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, which is now also available as an ebook. It can be found along with his other works, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at democracyatwork.info. So, welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, first comment, and I'm going to try to restrict my comments to waiting until each party has finished what they're saying. That may not always be the case. Anyway, there's an introduction from Hakim, clearly very welcoming, included overt endorsement and recommendation of Wolff's show. So Wolff should have the message here that this is a very friendly show. In other words, this is not a destiny situation where he needs to be strongly on guard. Let's see how Wolff runs with that.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So there are a few questions that we'd love to get your insight on. My channel and the political perspective of my channel is a little more in-depth and a little more into the theory than you might be used to in these sort of interviews, and I hope that's all right with you. My first question, and one I got requested from my audience, is, what are your opinions on the political and economic nature of China and its particular trajectory, with a focus on the question of imperialism, whether you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense? Could we get your opinion on that, please?
Okay, so good question. So hats off to Hakim and Hakim's audience for putting that one together, I guess. I think that this was a very, basic, non-loaded question and also phrased in a very clear way, with a focus on the question of imperialism. And then note that Hakim phrased it, quote, whether you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense. That's key. So good job on that. Wolff has just been handed a very easy, direct question by somebody who knows what he's talking about. This is not the destiny debate, conversation, whatever. This is somebody who knows what he's talking about and was able to phrase the question in a very clear and direct way for anyone who is in the Marxist universe, should have the ability to answer that question. I think it's also a great question to lead off with. China, I think, is taking a centrally important role in the world today. I myself, actually, I have not closed it off. If you want to go over to a video from a couple of weeks ago called Is China Socialist? Give your opinion below. If you haven't done that already, please go check that video out. I had 5 quick questions, taking a survey, and I will do a video on that. Eventually, I promise, having a busy summer. But anyway, Wolff has just been handed a clear and direct question about a topic of central importance. China seems to me like the U.S. is really starting to freak out about China. They thought that they could control them. China seems to be developing on their own, still using the money of Western capitalists. But Biden just came out at the G7 encouraging everybody to compete with and call out China. I'm going to do a separate video on that. It's a huge question, topic of great importance. What does Wolff say?
Sure. It has always been the case from the earliest days of socialism, and the same is true of communism, that different people interpreted what these words, what these terms mean. And the debate has been sometimes very strident, very loud, very intense, and at other times less so. By some definitions, then, China is a socialist economic system because in these definitions, socialism represents a powerful perhaps even dominating role of the government in regulating, taxing, shaping, influencing what the economy does on a day-by-day basis. In these definitions of socialism, some would argue it's perfectly okay if the capitalist system functions under the control of the government, that there are private enterprises owned and operated by citizens who have no particular role in the government. These can be the total story of industry, or it can be a split system. Some run by the government, some enterprises, some industries, others run by private entrepreneurs, private owners, and operated. Scandinavia uses that concept of socialism. Germans, French, Italians, and others also do. The socialist parties in many parts of Europe advocate a socialism that's defined in that way. Traditionally, particularly after the Russian Revolution, when socialism split, a different interpretation became powerful.
I'm just going to break in here with another comment. So far, what Wolff has said has been totally and wholly irrelevant to the question. This is not Hakim's doing, and I don't blame Hakim for breaking in here at all. I'm just commenting on this video. I would have let Wolff continue, saying whatever he's saying, so not a criticism. Just criticizing Wolff, he starts off with the same quote, different people interpreted what these terms mean, and there's been debate, blah, blah, blah. Okay, except that the question was, quote, whether you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense, unquote. That was the question. So, Wolff goes down this whole track of, quote, by some definitions then, well, totally irrelevant, because that isn't what Hakim asked you. And then now we're on, quote, Scandinavia uses that concept of socialism. France and Germany also do. What the fuck are you talking about? First of all, I remember having a conversation a few years ago with somebody from Sweden, and she was adamant saying, what we do is not socialism. That was, the USSR, that was Eastern Europe. We have democracy. That's what she told me. So I'm not even sure Scandinavian people think that they have socialism, let alone that it doesn't follow, any kind of Marxist-Leninist sense. You have this sort of reformist social democracy. I mean, I guess it's better, whatever. It's still tied into imperialism. But you see how far the conversation has shifted. Wolff was asked flat out, do you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense? That was the question. He's now talking about France, Germany, and Scandinavia. Let's let him continue, and maybe he will answer this question at some point.
That took also a different name, communism. And in that name, it was imperative that the government own and operate all of industry, or most at least of industry, directly as state enterprises. And you have those in the Soviet Union, you had them in the Soviet Union, you have them in the past of China, and you have them in the present of China. And by these definitions, these are socialist societies, whether it's Sweden or the People's Republic of China. But there are definitions that are different. And in those definitions, neither of these societies, that is, neither the social democracies of Europe nor the People's Republic of China.
All right, breaking in again. You know what this sounds like to me is bullshit. Why is he talking about Sweden? Bro, you were asked head on, do you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense? There's no ambiguity about that. Also, no one mentioned Sweden. We're well past, there has been debate and discussion. You're talking to Marxist-Leninists. Can you answer the question or not? It really sounds like just somebody spinning bullshit. Continuing.
Qualify for the term. And that's just a matter of the definition. Let me explain. There is a way of looking at socialism as a fundamentally different economic system in the sense of how production of goods and services is organized. You can read Marx or Lenin or any of the other great thinkers in the tradition as having a view that socialism is not about the greater or lesser role of the government. Indeed, I'll overstate the case, but to make the point clear, it's irrelevant whether the government has a larger or smaller role in regulating or taxing, or for that matter, running businesses.
Okay, breaking in again, not the question also. So now Wolff, by starting on this whole quote, how production is organized, now he's pitching his warped, anarchist tinged take on Marx, which he tries to pull Lenin into. He just said you can read Marx or Lenin or any of the great thinkers as not particularly caring what the government does. That's false. That's not true. It's also not the question. Let's see if he ever answers this.
Much more important for the socialism versus capitalism debate or discussion or differentiation is the question of the organization of production. Capitalist organizations have a split between a minority that run the enterprise, they are called employers, and the majority who work in an enterprise, who are called employees. In this definition, capitalism exists if and when and to the extent that the employer-employee organization of production is in place in the economic system. The alternative would be a completely different organization that can be called a communism, which has sometimes happened, or can be called a worker cooperative. That's a more familiar name. And the basic idea there is no split between employer and employee.
This has nothing to do with the question. Nothing to do with the question. Nothing. This is like, again, it's the article I just read from him earlier before we started the video. It's just him pitching this thing. Quote, in the definition, which has nothing to do with Leninism, by the way, which is what you were asked about. But in this definition, which Wolff has invented, capitalism exists to the extent that the employer-employee relationship is in place. No one asked, we asked about, in the Leninist sense of imperialism, is China imperialist? We're getting now into how worker cooperatives, no one asked you about worker cooperatives. I'm sorry, but this is just, he's been talking for several minutes and it's not even remotely on topic. Continuing.
All the participants in every enterprise are both part of the collective employer and part of the collective of employees. And they have a kind of democratic system, one worker, one vote. All decisions are made collectively, democratically. The kinds of decisions, including what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with any profits generated or any surplus generated in the enterprise. If that is done democratically and collectively by all the participants, well, then it qualifies as having gone beyond capitalism. And by implication, clear implication, if you have not done that, if either your private or your public enterprises, either of them or both of them, continue to utilize the employer-employee structure, then they would not qualify under this definition.
Okay, frankly, this is embarrassing. When I finished my last comment and resumed the video, and he was still talking about this stuff, I was embarrassed for him because, I mean, he comes off as just like going off on this horrible tangent that isn't even remotely close to talking about China. So he keeps talking about this other definition he uses, which to me sounds like anarchism, about unless you have like perfect horizontality. So here's the problem with all of this. that I have basically. One thing he has not mentioned at all is the existence of classes. He's talking about the employer-employee relationship on the micro level. He's not talking about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is, I mean, when you talk about class conflict and class struggle in the larger society, or the influence of the bourgeoisie, it goes a lot further than just the workplace and who calls the shots on the shop floor. Yes, that's important. You know who stands in the way most of workplace democracy? Obviously, the bourgeoisie. Why? They're trying to protect their private investments. They're trying to protect their capital. You simply don't have the same type of situation because he's trying to equate a society which has a dominant bourgeoisie, which is the ruling class, running industry for profit, with a society which has confronted in a revolution their bourgeoisie and either completely eradicated the bourgeoisie as a class through the abolition of private property, or at least greatly suppressed them through selective elimination of major types of private property, at least. You have a situation where the bourgeoisie is no longer the ruling class. The proletariat is the ruling class through the party. He's entirely sidestepping all of this and just going to the micro level. This is a favorite fixation of anarchists who want it all now, and unless it's perfectly horizontal, unless property is perfectly socialized in a stateless system, etc., then, it might as well be capitalism. So I know that he isn't entirely against the state, although he, along these lines, is frequently speaking about how he's skeptical of the government and the government has nothing to do with anything. Well, if the government has nothing to do with anything, how are you going to suppress your bourgeoisie? I don't think he has an answer to that question. I think this is really going to mislead people, is what I think. I think people who take what Wolff is saying to heart, they're going to get pushed away from the solutions that have worked. They're going to get actually pushed away from really anything that has existed since the founding of the USSR, whether it's Marxism, Leninism, or Trotskyism, or like whatever version of it. He's reverting back to some sort of, fictionalized revision of what Marx was all about, and he's trying to drag Lenin into it. All right, going to rein it in. We'll go back to the comments, but this is really kind of infuriating.
Under the term socialism. So if you use that last definition, then the People's Republic of China is not a socialist society. Or if you use the European social democratic definition, then it definitely is. I don't have any sense of there being any authority that tells you which of these definitions is somehow legitimate and which one isn't. I could enter the debate and talk about which ones I like more and less and where I line myself up.
Yes, you could. In fact, that was what you were asked to do. Okay? Also, no one was asking you about social democracy or anarchism. You were asked, is China imperialist in your opinion in the Leninist sense? He talked about a lot of other stuff for about 5 minutes without even coming close to answering that question. Maybe as he wraps up and tries to wriggle out of this question, he will emit some dying gasp that vaguely resembles an answer.
I understand that there are different traditions. Socialism is a global social movement. Marxism expanded from Marx's death toward the end of the 19th century, and over the last 150 years has gone into every society in the world. These are societies at utterly different levels of economic, political, cultural development, and of course, they interpret the works of Marx or Lenin differently. And that difference is a reality that will play itself out, but there's no authority that can designate one of them as right and the other one as wrong. Insofar as you connect, as Lenin did, the desire, the need to control other countries so as to secure their markets for yourself, or to secure their raw materials or their food to feed your own working class. If what you mean by imperialism is this move to control foreign, then any society with an employer-employee division, particularly if it makes profit its bottom line, as most societies with employer-employee relationships do, well, then they will exhibit this movement to control their sources of inputs of raw materials, food and manufacturers, and so on, and likewise to control their markets. That's how capitalism has always worked. And if you see capitalism as the employer-employee relationship, well, then you would conclude that China participates in doing the same sorts of things.
Okay, that was not an answer at all. He seems to be done, finally. And Hakim was clearing his throat a few times, which sounded like more than a sore throat, but like, are you ever going to shut up? And I got to say, I might have interrupted him at some point. I'm not criticizing Hakim for not, but it was pretty clear Hakim, I think, was trying to subtly prompt him of like, are you going to answer this sometime today? And, I wholeheartedly support that. Wolff gave an embarrassingly rambling answer there. So here's what Wolff's answer lacked, and then we're going to go on to Hakim's next question or follow-up or whatever it is next. I have not watched this whole video yet. When Wolff was asked this question, all he had to do was start off with saying, well, in my opinion, I think socialism is XYZ. But you asked about the Leninist definition. Here's my understanding of that. Based on what Lenin wrote in X, Y, and Z, these are some criteria for imperialism. Now let me cite you some evidence of China's behavior, A, B, C, and D. Here's why some of it matches that definition. Here's why some of it doesn't. You could look at it this way. You could look at it that way. But there you go. I have cited some evidence of both what the Leninist definition of imperialism is, showing you that I understand what it is. And here are a few examples of China's documented behavior. And, therefore, I've shown you that I know what I'm talking about in that regard. And then, we can talk about whether you agree with the interpretation or whether you, want to challenge some of the facts that I've cited, etc. That's what should have happened. This, again, embarrassing. Just what was that? I give that an F. I give that an F. It was, not only did it totally deviate from the question, barely answering it, the only time he even came close to answering it is sort of implying that China is profit driven, although again, without explaining that, citing any evidence, etc. Didn't talk about, the Chinese government publishes their development plans regularly. You could talk about that and attempt to analyze that instead of talking in these vague ideological generalities. Wow, was that? It would be disappointing if it were anyone else. I'm very familiar now with Wolff's style. It's par for the course. So I just kind of yawned through it. But wow, was that ever lacking? And why does he keep doing these appearances if, he just wants to plug worker cooperatives as being the only valid form of socialism, even though what's his example of it in practice? Titoism? I'm going to make a quick point before we go over to Hakim. I read the Tito audiobook that he recommended. I then also read the Hoja audiobook that was directly criticizing Titoism. And I think a great point that Hoja made in there was all of the ways that they were not applying Marxist-Leninist solutions, such as solving the national question. We know that Yugoslavia devolved into civil war in the 90s, ethnic civil war, showing that the ethnic national question was never settled. And you had a horrible, horrible situation. Meanwhile, in Albania, they have the most religiously tolerant society on earth, according to a UN report I was just reading. Now, I know that Albania is a little bit of a special situation. It's a very unique country. Nonetheless, the pattern that I see here is people in the whole cooperative world tend to be real heavy on concept and theory. And then in practice, it just winds up being capitalism. And I don't know, maybe Hakim will confront him with that at some point in this video. Anyway, I'll end my comments there, but wow. And I realize I'm kind of yelling, but wow, that was an awful answer to a very direct question. This may be a difficult watch here. Continuing.
Thank you. Many people would follow that train of thinking and would agree with you. There's one prominent side of the left that has a perspective I would like to get your opinion on, though. Their belief is that China's system is a mixing of both private capitalist and state capitalist formations with a communist party in the so-called commanding heights of the economy, so to speak. And they're in an extended new economic policy directed at developing the productive forces to a point in which the level of development would allow for abundance, where we could transition or lay the base to complete the construction of socialism, or at least enter into the primary stage of socialism as it was described by Lenin. Would you agree with the statement, and could we get your opinion on it?
Okay. So that was a great question by Hakim. I'm cringing pretty hard, actually, anticipating Wolff's response to this, and just there's another half an hour of this video left. First of all, that was, like I said, an excellent follow-up question, which basically takes Wolff's answer and kind of throws it out the window. Like, yeah, that wasn't what I asked you. Here, let's get specific in these particular ways. And I think that question did an excellent job of getting specific in some very particular ways. Like, look, here's what China says it's doing. Here's why some people who consider themselves Marxist-Leninists are skeptical of that. What do you think, given these very particular questions? So good job. Why I'm cringing is just like Wolff's entire strategy went out the window of like totally redefining socialism, which Hakim was like, yeah, very interesting. However, that's not what we're talking about. Yeah, I see Wolff get himself out of this one.
Sure. I think it's a perfectly reasonable inference, based on what I just said in response to your first question, to see the People's Republic of China as making a kind of new economic policy, a version, if you like, of what Lenin led the Soviet Union into in 1921 or so. I understand that letting private capitalists flourish, which they did in Russia, in Soviet Union, and they're doing obviously in the People's Republic of China, is intended by them to solve a whole raft of economic problems that hopefully will get them to a point where they can make the further transition. I commend them for understanding that what they are doing is not what socialism is, even in their definition, whatever exactly that is. In other words, that they have much more to do. I would qualify this, however, on a number of points. Number one, achieving economic growth, or whatever the word abundance is supposed to suggest, it's clear to me that that may be a necessary, but it is certainly not a sufficient condition to make the transition. That transition will be a difficult, rocky, deliberate act if it's going to happen. There would have to be the political, ideological, cultural commitment to radically transform China, in this case, to achieve such a transition. To imagine that it's somehow smoothly going to flow from economic growth is to repeat the kinds of thinking that Edward Bernstein or others indulged in at the end of the 19th century, imagining that capitalist growth somehow by itself or automatically or peacefully is going to make the transition to a socialism. I think that is unlikely and a very dangerous way to plan on what you're doing. I would also comment that there's a very famous speech Lenin gave either in 1921 or 22 before he got sick, in which he says explicitly that the Soviet Union is not yet a socialist society. And what he means, as best I can recall and remember, very important speech, is he refers to the Soviet Union at that time as a state capitalism in which the working class, through the Communist Party, has captured the state. And so now has an unusual, extraordinary power over what remains a capitalist system, but one that the state is in command of. And then he infers from this, he draws the conclusion that the question now is when and how the working class control of the state through the Communist Party can make the next transitions that have to be made to get the Soviet Union beyond state capitalism. 8 or 9 years later, after Lenin has died, and after the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky has been resolved for Stalin, Stalin makes the extraordinary statement that we have achieved socialism, albeit in only one country. He therefore, by a stroke, declares that he's basically changing the definition from what it had been in Lenin's mind, which said that Soviet state capitalism was just that, a state capitalism, to now declaring that the power of the Communist Party being what it is, even if they have employer-employee relationships in production, it is socialism because of the power of the state. In a way, Stalin therefore moves away from Lenin's greater focus on the organization of production to a more Scandinavian social democratic notion of the power, the regulatory power of the state. And it leads to this notion that socialism has been achieved in the Soviet Union, and that has been the basis for both subsequent Soviet and much of the history of the People's Republic of China referring to their society as socialist.
Thank you very much for that lovely and in-depth answer. Of course, there could be points I can add on further, but we're tight on time, so I think we should move on to the next question.
Okay, I understand why Hakim did that. However, I would have dug in a little bit more. Finally, things were getting interesting. If you've watched my commentaries before, you know that the more I disagree with somebody, the more often I am pausing it. Or, the less sense they're making, the more often I'm pausing it and jumping in with comments. Here, I actually sat there and listened because Wolff was, at least throwing the darts somewhere on the target, not, onto the opposite wall of the room. So he was at least somewhat on topic here. Now, what he said about China, he commended China for understanding what they're doing is not socialism, but they're trying to build the ground, lay the groundwork or build the conditions for full socialism. And so I guess my question to that would be, do we have reason to doubt China's commitment to making that transition? Which Wolff seemed to imply that he doubted that commitment, or at least it left, his answer, the way he stated that, left some room in my mind open for basically saying it will never happen. Well, I guess my question would be, if you think that that is not likely to happen, why? What do you think it would be something internal? Do you think it would be something external? And specifically what? What is China doing that, in your opinion, makes that transition more likely or more peaceful or whatever? And what about what they're doing or about external conditions, et cetera, would make it less likely? So I guess, for me, in pursuing socialism in general, in reading Marx and Lenin, this isn't a fandom for me. I view it as we're trying to prevent capitalism from destroying the world and everything in it, including us and all the fish in the sea and, everything else, and basically leaving this planet a hollowed out shell. If we're trying to prevent that, I don't really care if we hit, full employee less, I don't really care about how it goes, but or exactly on what timeline, as long as we do something that prevents not just climate emergency, but nuclear war, on and on. I mean, capitalism, we know by its nature. See the first question on imperialism, which got completely garbled beyond all recognition in that discussion. But basically, from the Leninist concept of imperialism, we know that capitalism needs to keep expanding and take over the entire world, and it needs to keep pulling regions into its influence and open up markets there and all of this stuff by force if needed, but they have to keep doing it for capitalists to stay in power, for profits to keep going in. And when I look at countries which you could argue are outside in some way that Western imperialist system, which is the most destructive force on the planet, arguably, it has the most power, the most technology, and just huge malice in terms of how it's willing to exercise that power in destructive ways. I mean, there was a statement made, I forget which Biden official it was, but just made a statement, it was shown on CGTN, that they're willing to suppress China, even if it means more poverty for the Chinese people. They just don't want a competitor. So when we look at all the countries who are outside of Western imperialism, you could look at Russia in some way. There's not the close alignment. And I mean, what Russia's doing is still capitalism, but it's not tied in exactly to that system. Or like in Iran, not a society I would want to live in, but arguably the hooks of Western imperialism haven't penetrated as deeply. What they're doing is not socialism, however, not even close. I think out of all these countries that could be any kind of a significant doorstop, any kind of a check on, and perhaps even possibly a counterpower, or perhaps even a superior rival who could one day dominate. The one that to me seems the closest to any kind of society that I would remotely want to live in, and guided by a philosophy which is the closest to actually existing socialism, that would be China. It's definitely not without its faults, but that's kind of my perspective on China, at least, is you have a major superpower with a lot of technology, a lot of people, a lot of at least education in Marxism, Leninism. There is at least some commitment to that there. Yes, they're allowing certain amounts of capitalism. Yes, you could say that that's a sign of some kind of major weakness or whatever. I'm not sure that I subscribe personally to that interpretation, but whatever. I get that there are hesitations and reservations that leftists of various stripes have about it, even Marxist-Leninists. I totally understand that. I think that that's a debate we should be having. And again, to Hakim's credit, I think that that is the conversation that this discussion with Wolff was set out to be. Wolff dodged it in favor of this masturbatory discussion of worker cooperatives, which, I'm sorry, that's not going to be what we need to stand up to the power of the United States, which is currently invading like 9 or 10 countries and supporting other countries doing horrible things that, are basically just an extension of the same overreach of the system as it needs to continually expand by violence to bring more exploitation into different areas. The question was, is China doing that? I submit no. If they were doing it, why did Biden just go to the G7 and say, hey, we need our own Belt and Road. We got to shut China's initiative down. We got to help the poor people. Yeah, okay, because that's what the U.S. is going to do, right? No, of course. They're terrified that China is going to shut out imperialism. So again, like I said, out of all these powers, it seems to me China is the closest to anything resembling socialism out of these major anti-Western imperialist powers. Okay, so, I apologize. I hope that this is all seeming like it's staying on subject and in a reasonable amount of time for people. I was looking forward to an intelligent answer from Richard Wolff on that question. And I think Hakim did his best. He may have just given up because it was clear Wolff was trying to dodge the question or answer dishonestly. Talking about what Lenin was doing in 1921 or 22, they were wrapping up the Civil War at that point. Come on. So, just we're in a situation now in 2021 where capitalism is literally threatening the existence of life on this planet. Sure, something could survive, maybe, unless we get a runaway greenhouse gas effect like the planet Venus. Who knows? But let's not find out the hard way. And like I said, I don't care if it takes till 2070 or 2090 or whatever. It doesn't matter. If we can begin the process of confronting capital, taking away its power, and getting ourselves into a situation where we can make the needed transition away from capitalism as quickly as it needs to happen to avoid not only ecological disaster and collapse, but of course, avoiding World War III and all of the other things that, capitalism is known for. So anyway, that's my orientation. I'm sorry about all this background noise. I'm in an attic. It's June, and I need the window open or I'm going to die of heat exhaustion. All right, enough about me. Let's get back to the video.
I would love to get your opinion on planning versus markets within socialist economics, particularly within socialist nation states and their economic policy. What your opinions are on strictly planning in the form of the Gosplan that existed within the Soviet Union or similar institutions within other socialist countries. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at roughly?
Yes, I understand your question.
Yeah?
Okay, another very good question. Good choice of a question, Hakim. Wolff talks an awful lot about cooperatives, including in this video when he wasn't even asked about them. Well, you recommended Tito and, what do you think about markets versus planning? One thing that seems to be the case is that the more planning you have, the less in reality your co-ops actually can do autonomously, that favorite word of anarchists. At which point you have to start to wonder if everyone's just following the plan. I mean, this whole employer-employee relationship, isn't it really just planner and planee? And if that's the way it needs to be to avoid all of the major crises of capitalism, I mean, I'm adding things to the question here, but just, filling this out based on the perspective that I was describing. We're in a world at the brink of major, major, major catastrophe. Whatever we can do to avoid those catastrophes, which are being brought on by industrial activity guided by capitalists for profit, and not just the pollution and the exploitation, but the wars that they need to engineer to do that, and all the political repression and everything else. Well, who gives a shit? Really, isn't doing what is effective more important than following, is it horizontal enough for right now? Anyway, let's see what Wolff has to say. And of course, I added a lot to that question, which I'm sure will not get addressed.
In any case, let me answer it this way. I have been mystified all of my adult life by the fascination on the left of the differential between prices and values in Marxian economics, and equally so on the debate between the public and the private, and then equally so on this planning versus the market. I find this extraordinary. I think all three of them are diversions from what I think are the central issues that ought to be capturing people's attention. And I feel as though the enemies of socialism and Marxism have been able to define what is to be debated, and that already tilts the playing field in their favor. I would urge people to think about that. But you ask the question, let me answer.
Okay, I'm just pausing that to respond to Wolff's preface to the question. So presumably, based on this insistence that he has about the employer-employee relationship and the primary importance of that, we can, I think, assume here that markets, not important, price versus value, not important. What is important is employer-employee. I think that's what we can get out of what he just said. I'm not there to ask him, so I don't know, but I would put money on it. Okay. That being the case, if that is the case, but let's assume that it is. I think that we have reason to assume that it is, based on the frequency of the topic and the way that he talks about it in his appearances. Well, I would contend that Wolff then, if that is his view of socialism, he really needs, he is positing like an entirely different branch of socialism than really I think anything that you or I listening to this channel are familiar with or dealing with. And I think that if he is taking it upon himself to do that, he needs to try to, if he wants to be taken seriously, answer the questions that Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin and Mao, etc., answered, and or reconfirmed by applying earlier answers in real life situations. How do you keep your bourgeoisie from doing what it does? Even in the case of Tito and Yugoslavia, that was armed resistance during World War II and an armed anti-fascist movement. Well, I think Wolffism here, it's like something completely different than anything else. And to Wolff, it's the only thing that makes sense, except he's only articulating the very basic points of it and then leaving all of the other major questions unexplained, really unaddressed in most cases. And, I don't think that it is going to be very popular with people who have gone beyond Socialism 101, because anybody who has will see he hasn't answered these questions, which are fundamental once you start tracing out the logic of, all right, well, okay, I got that point. So if I do that, then it creates this situation, which will create these problems which needed to be solved. And then he doesn't have answers for that. So anyway, I think, speaking of diversions, I was just thinking the same thing about him. It's kind of funny he said that. Uncanny. Anyway, that's the response to the preface. Let's hear his actual answer.
First of all, the word planning, without a lot of qualifying adjectives, leaves open an immense field, which is part of why this debate is bizarre to me. Every large multinational corporation plans everything. Indeed, it does so using many of the same tools that were developed, for example, by Gosplan in the Soviet Union and by the leading economists who developed linear programming planning models that have now been adapted by private enterprises because they understood that that's what it is they need to do. A large corporation usually gets that way by having, along the way of its growth, purchased and integrated all kinds of other companies, competitors, suppliers, buyers, vertical, horizontal integration. These multiple enterprises, as they are brought under one roof, require planning. Basically, what these corporations have done is gotten rid of the market. They don't want to have the market because it's too uncertain. They don't want to depend on the market to set the conditions under which they buy key inputs. And they don't want to rely on the market under the condition of having key buyers who buy their outputs. They want to control inputs and outputs, reducing market fluctuation and market uncertainty. And the logic of this is true not just for a corporation, but for an economy as a whole. You have more control, particularly if you are a governmental apparatus. Whether that's local or centralized government or decentralized really doesn't matter. But you can exercise more control, remove all kinds of fluctuations and risks if you substitute planning for markets, which is why all large capitalists have always done that and are doing it now. There's nothing odd or weird about socialists or communists or anybody else who wants to organize the economy as a whole to want to do the same thing. And so for me, this is a practical matter of how to achieve objectives. If you leave things to markets, you leave things to all the calculations made by people who are not focused on the global outcome. That's one of the problems of markets. That's why societies of all different kinds have tended to repress or limit or control. You can go back 5,000 years and see the debate between Plato and Aristotle about markets. Footnote, they didn't like markets. Plato wanted them gone altogether. Aristotle said we can't do it, it'll be too disruptive, so let's regulate them tightly. For them, markets were disruptive of social cohesion. That's their phrase. Exactly. That's what they are. You can do it, you can distribute goods and services through market exchange, but you will pay the price of fluctuations, interruptions that can ramify across the economy, number one. Number two, I don't like markets for all kinds of other reasons. And these are very simple. A market allocates scarce goods and services to people with the most money to pay for them. I find that extraordinary. If milk is in short supply for whatever reason, I don't want the people with the most money to be able to buy the milk to feed their pets. I'd rather have the milk go to feed the children. If the children's parents don't have the money, that's an interesting factoid, but I don't care because I have a different standard for what should happen when goods and services are scarce. And let me close this point by dramatizing to people. During World War II, when a huge portion of the resources of the United States were diverted from civilian goods to produce military goods for the war effort, the remaining resources usable for consumer goods meant that the quantity of consumer goods would be drastically curtailed. Had the distribution of those consumer goods that were still being produced been left to the market, only rich people would have been able to get the consumer goods. They would have bid up their prices until everybody else could not afford them anymore. That's how the scarcity would have been happened. It was determined by the government of the United States, Republicans and Democrats, who were 100% pro-capitalist, to dispense with the market. We set up a system in the United States called rationing. In order to buy a gallon of gas or a quart of milk or a pound of sugar or ounces of meat or many other commodities, coffee and cooking oil and all kinds of other things, you needed a ration card. If you didn't have the ration card, the storekeeper could not sell you the product. And he would go to jail if he sold it to somebody who didn't have a ration card. And how did you get a ration card? The government distributed. And how did the government distribute it? According to, get ready, people's needs. If you had a large family, you got a lot of ration tickets for milk. If you didn't have any kids, you didn't, and so on and so forth. So abolishing the market for a planned distribution using umpteen different possible systems is a triviality. Doesn't have much to do with the capitalism, socialism debate, and shouldn't have been allowed to become a focus of debate because it takes that debate away from much more crucial issues like whether you have an employer-employee dichotomy organizing your factories, offices, and stores, or whether you have a democratically run collective of the workers doing that.
Okay. First of all, I think that I won my bet because that is, first, I think his looking down to the left signifies he is done. Maybe he'll pop up with something else. But yeah, so he ended with, I think what's more important is employer-employee. Okay. We haven't even gotten into that. Maybe Hakim will ask him about that. To be honest, I'm so burned out on the topic of cooperatives. I don't think it's really that important. Wolff thinks it's super important. All right, so let me address what he said. I think that his thesis, which I disagree with, is not supported by his evidence, which I did agree with. I don't think, I found it odd, and maybe somebody can explain to me what I'm missing, but it seemed to me like he started out saying the distinction of public versus private, or the distinction of market versus some kind of planned distribution. He finds fascinating, bizarre, mystifying, and, the powers that be have shifted deliberately the discourse onto these totally irrelevant topics. He then went on to explain, and so just for the record, that was the thesis. I don't agree with that. He then went on to say, for as far as this topic being, bizarre and mystifying, baffling as to why people get so hung up on talking about this, he then went on for several minutes about why he doesn't like markets, how they promote inequality, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, granted, there has been a history over a long period of time about, debating, are we going to have markets or not? And that was done prior to capitalism as well as after capitalism, et cetera, or in attempts to move beyond capitalism, whatever. Except that, well, first of all, I have my main point, but to put this back on him, obviously I'm not going to get an answer because he's not here with me. But what I would ask in a situation like that is, and this goes back, for example, to, there's no real distinction over public or private. And, or at least, to the extent that he is fascinated and baffled by that, well, that tells us he thinks it's some kind of trivial or, it's of low importance. So he doesn't know why people get so hung up on that. Well, explain that. If that has, if you're trying to say that if you have, quote, public capitalism versus bourgeois capitalism, and that for the average working person, that will have no impact on their living standards, on the way that they have to compete in the labor market, et cetera, then explain that. Back it up with some evidence. Can you? I don't think you can. I think that in a system where you have wrested that amount of political control away from capitalists, where you're actually having the government step in and, run enterprises, and then the profits from that don't go into a capitalist's bank vault, and they don't go to buy those capitalists' yachts and expensive clothing and houses and, multiple houses and all that kind of stuff, private islands, whatever they buy. I'm not one. Can you explain that? Because I think that there is a substantial distinction there. And for reasons that also have to do with how you even get into a situation like that in the first place. Capitalists don't willingly hand over the means of production to the government under any circumstances. They do it out of necessity. Either they're being threatened by the working class to give it up, or they're pressured by some, inter-capitalist competition to do so. But why? Well, it goes to something else that he said. Capitalists don't want ration systems. The example he was using. Why? They prefer markets because goods go to the highest bidder, and they want more money for the stuff. And if they can milk more money out of rich people, well, you see where the logic of that goes. You're going to have a system where most of the stuff, money and goods and services, stays concentrated in the hands of the capitalist class, who then translate that into political power and maintain rulership of that society. And you get the world we have today, which wants markets because markets kind of keep that going. And although they may diverge from that system and implement rationing systems at this time of crisis or that, You know they all want to go back to the market system eventually. So Wolff knows better than this. And anyway, none of that really added up to me to these distinctions are meaningless or at least of low importance that we shouldn't spend so much time talking about them. I thought his explanation of markets directly underlined how they lead to massive inequality. Well, then why wouldn't you care about them? He doesn't explain. And then as far as the worker cooperatives, well, why is that more important? Why is that the key distinction? In some practical way, like a non-ideological way. How, he just expressed a clear preference against markets. Well, okay, why is the co-op distinction more important than that? He also doesn't say. And I contend it is not. Continuing.
Thank you very much for that lovely answer. I think we only have time for one more question, and that is this. Both myself and those that watch my channel are well aware of your work, your channel, and your views, particularly on cooperatives and the rearrangement of the organization of enterprises. So my question is, what is your view of cooperatives going into socialism? Like in a capitalist system, let's say, for example, in the current United States or whatever other country, say Bangladesh, for example, if there was to be a buildup of cooperative enterprises or reorganization via buyouts, like workers buying out their enterprises and reorganizing, if that were to happen, how would the next stage or transition to socialism occur? My question somewhat falls into the reform versus revolution question. How would the conquering of state power, if it were to take place at all, how would that play into simply reorganizing the enterprise? Is that enough for us to reach socialism, or is there another step required after this buildup of cooperatives?
Excellent question. Nailed it. Very good job. I mean, there could have been more follow-up on the previous question. I understand the time limitations if you're going to spend your time discussing one thing, it's what Hakim just asked. So excellent use of time. Let's see what Wolff says, because this really is the heart of the matter.
If you're asking how it's going to work in the future, the only honest answer I could give you is I don't know. Nobody does.
Come on. Yeah, okay, you don't have a time machine and you haven't seen the future, but what's your theory? Obviously, that's the question. Can you present, you're going around on your YouTube channel and everybody else's YouTube channel spouting this cooperative stuff while seemingly kind of shitting on other forms of socialism as inadequate in some way. Well, lay it out. Here's your thing. Lay out your grand theory and let's see if it's convincing or not. And go.
But what I can do, and what I think you're asking me to do, is to give you a sense of how I imagine or see such a transition coming. So let me do that, and hopefully that responds to your question. I would expect that the evolution and development of worker co-ops produces in the economic system something comparable to what Lenin and Trotsky and the others called dual power. In other words, you're going to create an alternative economic structure. Worker co-ops are going to be a part, if they develop, of a society in which capitalistically organized enterprises, that is hierarchical, with a tiny minority at the top, the owner of the business, the board of directors if it's corporate, and so on, make all the key decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits, versus a worker co-op where those same decisions are made by everyone, no one is excluded, one person, one vote, majority rules, democracy. These two enterprises are now going to be coexisting. And that means that every government program in such a society is, whether you intend it or not, going to become contested. That is, the capitalistically organized enterprises want the government to sustain and support them, as it has in every capitalist country for at least the history of the capitalism in each country. The worker co-ops are going to have an alternative set of demands that they put on the state. If subsidies are to be given out, they want some. If the tax law is to be changed, they have ideas on how to do that. If capital is scarce for worker co-ops to get going or to enlarge, they want the state to address that. The capitalist enterprises are going to push in alternative and often contested ways. Well, the capitalists have something already that the co-ops don't have. The capitalists have political parties. In the United States, for example, they have the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, who are each outdoing the other to be supportive and celebratory towards capitalism. Worker co-ops, by contrast, have no political party. So the next step, to answer your question, is for the worker co-ops to understand that they have to do what the capitalists learned they had to do as they emerged out of feudalism. They had to develop political parties that were advocates at the level of the state. Whether the state was a king or the state was a parliament, it really doesn't matter. Their political parties, starting small, had to grow to become powerful enough to shape governmental policy to enhance the capitalist enterprises whose growing wealth would allow more resources to shape the politics in a back and forth that explains the last 200 years of capitalism. I would expect something comparable to happen, that the worker co-ops understand, both for their advance but also for their protection of what they already have, they need political representation and they need political parties, and they will form them. And just like in capitalism, the worker co-ops will be the economic base of such a political party. It will raise money, it will recruit, it will spread the word, and the parties, in turn, will put into place elected officials and others who will get the legislation that enhances the growth and power of the co-ops. Could there then come a time when frictions develop, hostilities develop, and we then have a conflict between the capitalist sector and its parties on the one hand, and the co-op sector and its parties on the other, and that becomes akin to a civil war? Absolutely, that's one way that this may get fought out. In some parts of Europe, the capitalist parties basically were able to eventually take state power with not too much in the way of civil military strife. In others, they couldn't. They had to go to a military solution. The French Revolution is the obvious example. But the English Revolution a century or so earlier, and even the American Revolution, the decision was made in the United States, and it was debated. Do we want to become independent and set up our own monarchy? No. The decision was made, not only do we become independent from the British monarch of the time, George III, but we're not going to set up our own monarchy. We don't want a monarchy. They made the break from the feudal, the residue, if you like, of monarchy. And I think worker co-ops will be in comparable struggles about the political shape of their growth within a capitalist system that is, in my judgment, already having fundamental problems that it cannot solve.
Okay, he's looking down and to the left, so I think he's done. Again, more substance to that answer, but do I agree? Well, okay, Wolff's basic answer is co-ops would form dual power, a kind of parallel economy, kind of parallel economic industrial infrastructure, which at some point could grow to have political influence and then confront and defeat capital in either a violent or nonviolent manner. So I'm not sure I agree with this. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't. So what Wolff said is, first of all, this is following right along with the article I read earlier, if you recall. It's exactly what Wolff said. in that article about, co-ops getting political parties, etc. But didn't we already, quote, learn this back in the days of the labor movement? And what happened to that? So co-ops are not a new invention. Co-ops have been around for a super long time. I mean, in the 1800s, there were co-ops. The Knights of Labor, which was a large, I guess, somewhat radical for its time, although they were anti-immigrant and some other things, labor federation in the 1880s, 1890s. They basically fell out of existence in the 1890s and then were replaced by the much more radical and, in my view, mostly Marxist oriented IWW. Footnote, the IWW would later have several ideological splits and become more anarchist or soft socialist, or anyway, there would be splits. But I think at the outset, that was the most radical revolutionary thing we had by far, organizing the unorganized. Anyway, co-ops existed then and they got defeated. We then had a massive labor movement, which built itself up. And then there was the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare and McCarthyism. And basically under McCarthyism, you couldn't be like, you had to swear allegiance to capitalism, basically. And what happened was all the more radical leaning labor unions like the CIO, which was kind of like a more mainstream IWW, collapsed. And then they got swallowed up by the AFL because you couldn't be a labor radical. You couldn't be a socialist, communist, or anarchist and be in any position of public influence. The ruling class made sure of it. So then the labor movement peaks at its membership in 1960, and it's been in decline ever since. Possibly it's gotten so low that one of the recent years saw like a slight increase, but it's basically like, it's as low as it practically can be at this point. So I guess my point about co-ops having to learn that they need political parties, didn't we already learn this? And we already have 100 years of history about the many ways in which that can go wrong and not turn out. And I think people did a lot of things right back then, and it still didn't work, meaning that there's something else going on here. Yes, I mean, the United States is such an unusual country. I mean, it's been expanding territorially, even, using 1905, for example, as a reference point. I mean, I think that not even all of the 48 continental states were states yet at that point. I think like maybe Arizona and New Mexico weren't even states yet. The US was still growing, expanding. It just seemed like they had unlimited resources and space, and it would just go on forever and just keep expanding, and there would be prosperity for all and blah, blah, blah. And, working people saw that they needed to fight for something, but they didn't necessarily, they didn't fight to overthrow what was happening. Although it's interesting, you go back to older videos of interviews from people on these topics. There's an interesting documentary channel, David Hoffman. There's a video he does talking to the silent majority and what they really thought. And like the average person, this was in the suburbs of Chicago, around 1970, had a lot more, at least elementary class consciousness than people have today. They were against the wars. They thought the wars were just being fought for big manufacturers, etc. So like something else is happening. Didn't we already learn this? And didn't it not entirely work? Why? Well, you're talking about using the US political system. Is that even going to work? Or do they have it locked up tighter than a maximum security prison? I mean, honestly, and if co-ops start throwing money into the system, is that just going to be a waste of money? Could it be the end of the co-ops? I think that there are a lot of questions here which really need to be explored with much more detailed models. I'm very skeptical of that approach. As far as the frictions, I think that they would develop immediately. In fact, I think they've already anticipated, the capitalists have already anticipated something like this, and they've already made moves to shut us out from the start. The Taft-Hartley Act, one of the things that contributed to the collapse of the CIO, I mean, they took every labor practice that was effective in terms of industrial actions, types of strikes and solidarity actions, and they just made them illegal. So, I mean, they seem to be on top of that. So Again, I'm not sure that this is a particularly good theory. It's not necessarily wrong, but I would need to see a lot more discussion to, and again, tie it back to historical examples outside the United States. Many of them. Before we get people, and we need solutions now, need them. There's a lot of really dangerous stuff happening in the world on multiple fronts. We need solutions now. I am not convinced here, and I used to be in a co-op. I was a member of a worker cooperative, and I viewed it as a political move based off of advice exactly like this. I now think it was a foolish waste of time. The co-ops in the area didn't cooperate with each other. Like, none of the things he was describing were actually happening, because it's still kind of a petty bourgeois mindset at the end of the day. I think trying to revive the labor movement makes a hell of a lot more sense. I mean, yeah, you do need to build dual power and community organizations and whatever. And I'm not opposed to co-ops necessarily, but I think that I'm totally unconvinced by this as a model of change. I think that there even could be more effective methods of building dual power. I think Wolff is just ideologically married to this thing. Has he been in a co-op before? I mean, honestly, look at the state of the U.S. worker cooperative movement. I would encourage people right now, if you're doing it just for a job, there's nothing wrong with joining a co-op necessarily, but don't do it for political reasons. I have done that, and I don't really, if I could get some of that time back, I would take it back. All right. There is some more time in this interview. Let's see where it goes.
Thank you so much for that absolutely phenomenal answer. If you would indulge us, just to piggyback off that question, in your book, Contending Economic Theories, where you take a look at neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian concepts, there's a passage in which you consider the Yugoslav experience of cooperatives and cooperative buildup. You speak of it positively. My question about this is, what would be the criticisms of the Yugoslav implementation, and would it align, or are you familiar with the criticisms of that type of system made by, for example, Yakovenko and Cockshott in critiquing what they would have considered market socialism with the cooperative presence? Simply, my question, very condensed, is, what is your criticism of the Yugoslav implementation from the economic perspective, less so the political overbearingness?
Great question. There's still a few minutes of this left, so I don't know if Hakim manages to sneak in another question after this. I have not watched this, but this ties in exactly with what we have been building up to this video by reading. I have nothing really to add. Great question. Let's hear what Wolff says.
Okay. There are a number of ways to do this, although how you could separate it from the political in the case of Yugoslavia strikes me as difficult, and I'm not sure why you would really want to do that. What I like about Yugoslavia was, let me be blunt, they were daring. They wanted to take the socialism that they had inherited, European socialism, and take it right down into the workplace. Since that's something that matters a great deal to me, it's how I understand, interpret, and teach Marxian economics and have all my life. I take my hat off to this effort to bring the revolution right down into the enterprise, to trust the mass of people, to imagine that they can be more than the drones of labor that capitalism has always made the majority of people. The folks who come 9 to 5, 5 days a week or more, whatever the case may be, do what they're told, how they're told, where they are told, and at the end of each day go home having lost all connection. Marxism likes the phrase alienation with the fruits of their labor, of what they have poured their brains and muscles into all day long. This is a horrific psychological and social catastrophe, and that they were willing in Yugoslavia more than the Russians or other Eastern Europeans, with some exceptions. Collective farms in Czechoslovakia and so on are important exceptions. But with those exceptions, they were willing to try to set up genuine worker-run, worker-owned enterprises. The problem is, when you have that move, you then have to adjust all of the other institutions of a modern economy so that they do not undermine, run counter to, obstruct what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. Look, it's a truism in the history of markets that markets are different depending on the class structures they mediate. How does the market affect, for example, slavery had markets. Every American city in the American South has a monument somewhere to the slave markets that existed in Charlotte, in Atlanta, in you name it, wherever it was. Markets in slavery are different from what the markets were in European feudalism, and each of them is different from what the markets were in slavery. Markets are powerful, socially influential institutions. What you have to do is you have to change the way markets work in a society like Yugoslavia was trying to create so that they reinforce and do not undermine and disrupt what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. That had to be learned by each social system that tried to use markets. And by regulating markets, I also mean suspending them, not using markets when it isn't the best way to go. When the very social structure you're developing in an enterprise is better served by abolishing the markets here. That's why I gave you the example of the rationing in World War II. It was better to win that war and reinforce American capitalism. It was better to abolish the market in a whole raft of consumer goods than to keep it going. It's a mechanical way of thinking to think that these institutions all have to line up at the same time in the same way. They don't. You need to understand what is your priority and then adjust the institutions. To make a long story short, I don't think the folks in Yugoslavia figured that out, understood that, and took the steps that were necessary. And I don't mean to be a Monday morning quarterback. I doubt that anybody could have done much better than what they did. But they also then had the problem, which is crucial, and I need to say it. If you understand what we're saying, those of us that advocate the abolition of the employer-employee relationship, or to use the same language to say the same thing, if you really understand what it means to abolish the class structure of the capitalist enterprise, well, then it follows that the political system, like the market, has to be adjusted to that reality. You now have to understand that the state is no longer dependent upon and interactive with the people of a capitalist system, namely the people who run the enterprise. It is now directly connected to the mass of people since they're the ones who run each enterprise in the workplaces that they are engaged in. You have to give them their space. You have to give them their right to make mistakes, to make judgments that may or may not be consistent with your economic plans. This is a very complicated, delicate kind of adjustment. It's comparable to the adjustments capitalist governments had to make in the transition from feudalism, or feudal governments in the transition from slavery, and those were difficult transitions. But this one is difficult too, and I don't think, however great a wartime leader he was, Tito, the leader in Yugoslavia at the time of these experiments, I don't think there was a developed understanding of what trusting the people, which is what you have to do here, what that really means. And I don't think they thought it was possible. And look, they may have been right. It may not have been at the time. But then if you make that judgment, then your options and what you could have done, including internally to the worker co-ops, would have been very different from what they seemed to have imagined they could do. And when they failed, of course, then they failed catastrophically.
Absolutely fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
I'm very grateful that you found the time to come and talk to me today and to impart your knowledge on me and everybody else who will enjoy watching this video. If you could, possibly on these topics that we discussed today, for example, China, markets, planning, Yugoslavia, if you can think of any book recommendations that you may give that can further expand this discussion, please feel free to say so. Otherwise, we can just continue to the end.
Sure. I have written 3 books over the last 3 years that were mainly written in order to answer the flood of questions that come into us because I do a lot of public speaking. So if these comments I've made are interesting, let me simply mention them because they will contain elaborated versions of what you just heard me say. The first one, published about 2.5 years ago, was called Understanding Marxism. The second one, published a year later, was called Understanding Socialism. And the third one was just published a few months ago, is called The Sickness is the System, When Capitalisms Fail to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. All 3 of those books are available at our website, which is democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. So anyone interested, that would be the best way to get a more elaborated presentations of these points.
Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. This has been a very eye-opening talk, and I hope that everybody has learned a lot from having the pleasure of listening to you speak. As for me personally, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. On a personal note, I've been watching your videos, and I've read almost every work you've published. I have not read your bachelor's thesis yet on colonization in Kenya, but just about everything else.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. I enjoy talking about these topics. I've been studying and teaching this material for a long time and am very engaged with it. So this is an opportunity for me to refresh my thinking, to think again, and that's as it should be. So I'm grateful to you as well.
All right. Well, this will be all for today. Again, thank you again for coming and joining us and using your very valuable time, I'm aware, to talk to me tonight. Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, so we did it. Video's over, fade to black. I have comments. So I guess working backwards there, Wolff did just recommend some books, Understanding Marxism, Understanding Socialism, and The Sickness is the System. I have gotten copies of those books. I have not read them yet, and most likely, if I continue the Richard Wolff series, I will use those books as a basis for further criticism in the process of understanding Richard Wolff, to the extent that that's a worthwhile pursuit, understanding Richard Wolff. He is out there currently, and he's doing his thing, and he's influencing people. And to that extent, I think it's worthwhile to criticize and understand Wolff. And, there aren't a ton of prominent Marxists in the U.S. So anyone who achieves any sort of prominence deserves to be scrutinized. It's just how it works, in academia or politics or really anything else. So that's why we're doing this. There's a lot of people who weigh in on the comments sometimes who don't understand the purpose of critique. Criticism, it exists to just, better understand things, to increase intelligence around particular questions and situations, and to push back and to, raise points of disagreement. This is healthy and normal. So anyway, I don't see a ton of Richard Wolff fanboys, so, it tends to be not so contentious. Also, I think that a lot of the points that I'm raising about Richard Wolff are not unique to me necessarily. I tend to, here we're doing a 2-hour plus video about it and a whole series. But I think a lot of people think these things. I know I say that because I hear it from people in the comments and such. Okay, so getting back to what he was asked about Titoism and all of that. First of all, I want to ask, and this is an overarching question for the entire video, how and why did Wolff end up with this somewhat unusual interpretation of Marx? And I'm wondering if he specifies that in the book. So that's one of the questions that we will be delving into when we get into the books, is like, does he cite passages from Marx, or like, does he actually make a case for like, how did he wind up with co-ops are socialism, period? Anyway, this is not a standard conclusion, and people have reached other conclusions for some particular reasons, and I'd be really interested in understanding what his reasons are in this scenario, particularly when it doesn't align with many other people's interpretations of Marxism and how to implement it and everything like that. So, but it does actually sound a lot like anarchism to me, or, anarcho-communism or whatever. I just call it anarchism. Wolff made a comment in here about setting up society so that it doesn't interfere with your co-ops, which he felt that Yugoslavia had not done. This struck me as putting the cart before the horse. But then again, Wolff's entire system of like, let's look at the micro level and build that up, strikes me as putting the cart before the horse in kind of typical anarchist fashion. He also made the statement, quote, "I don't think anyone could have done better than they did," unquote, necessarily, meaning that this was the best that probably anybody could do with the situation that existed in Yugoslavia. Okay, well, at least as far as, trying to implement those goals, but could things have gone better had they done something differently? In which case, maybe the cooperative approach was not the best approach. That would be a major question I would have. For example, had they cooperated with the Soviet Union more, could Yugoslavia have turned into some kind of, linchpin in, for example, spreading communist revolution to Italy, let's say? I'm not saying that definitely would have happened, but I'm saying that history would have unfolded somewhat differently, maybe not that differently, maybe very differently. We don't know. So overall, it didn't fare any better than any of the other European communist states, and arguably worse, because many of them did not end up with horrific ethnic civil wars in the 90s. So anyway, continuing, Wolff makes the point that in a society where everything is socialized property into the cooperative system, not socialized as state property, but socialized as co-ops, then the state would be regulating the masses rather than just the bourgeoisie or just the business owners. They would be, when they tried to regulate industry or, plan and make mandates towards industry, they would be dealing with the entire mass of people rather than one particular class or this particular class. And he talked about giving them, quote, the space to make mistakes. So my question about that is that in a situation such as existed in Eastern Europe, I mean in the world, but, Yugoslavia is in Eastern Europe, in that situation, did the people really have the space to make those kinds of mistakes while capitalism still existed in the way that it did? Angry, empowered, ruthless, bloodthirsty, and desperate to shut down the USSR and all of the allied countries. They were willing to go to extreme lengths to do that, just like they're now gearing up to try to shut down China. So Wolff also made the statement that, quote, "it may not have been possible to trust the people at the time." Okay, well, if we're going to acknowledge that maybe this whole strategy is not the leading strategy, particularly given the strength of the global bourgeoisie, maybe we could just back off of it for a while. And like when you're asked about, Leninist interpretations, stop talking about cooperatives, for example. It just might be worth shifting off of this when there are so few examples. And again, we're in an emergency situation. I want to know that the future of the human race, free of war, exploitation, and a land so toxic that there's birth defects everywhere, et cetera, I want to do whatever it takes to get beyond that. We know that capitalism is what's creating that world, and we need to get beyond it. As of the time being, the particular form and the particular timeline of this or that, I want whatever is going to work, because literally if we fail at this point, if projections are accurate, we lose the Earth and we lose ourselves. And we take down a lot of completely innocent species of animal and plant life along with us. So those are the stakes. I don't think that Richard Wolff sees the end of any of this, or maybe even the beginning of any of this, in his lifetime. I know that, I personally have enough life left ahead of me that I have plenty of time left to spare. And I know there's plenty of people much younger than I, and then there's future generations who haven't even been conceived yet. We need solutions here. We need them. It's not a choice. It's imperative. Capitalism cannot fundamentally change course. It can't do anything other than it's doing. And unless we come up with a mass planetary scale solution that can stop capitalism, we're fucked. That's it, literally that simple. So, I don't know. I guess that's where I'm coming from in all of this, is we have a desperate need in this situation. And, you can go two ways. You can debate basics too much. You can get into hypothetical particulars too much. Ultimately, we need something that works, and we need it really fast. The discussions that I'm most interested in, and, at a certain point, you need more than discussion. We need things that are oriented towards attaining that next step, and the next and the next, and as quickly as possible. I may be stating the obvious when I say this, but those really are the stakes, and that's where I'm coming from. I mean, this, I cared enough about all of this to start this channel. It kills me sometimes when people devolve into the kind of ego trip of bashing people for the sake of bashing. Please be aware, any critiques I do on my channel are coming from an honest place. If I say something, it's not for clout. It's in my, the amount of information, the amount of kind of the extent that my view is informed, I'm coming from a genuine place because, just take housing, for example. What's going on right now? There's a homelessness crisis. There's a housing price crisis. No one's even talking about it. And I think it's going to take a, quote, market correction on the level of the 2008 crash to bring prices even remotely back to where they're at all even slightly affordable. Yet, a crash like that can have gigantic, enormous, earth-shaking ramifications in other ways. We need a new system. We needed it a century ago. We still need it. I guess I'm just pleading with people, can we stop with all of these fake solutions? I don't know if we're going to fix this problem. I really don't know if we will or not. But that's where I'm coming from. And to the extent that you're in the same boat, hi, how are you doing? It may be that the United States, where I live, is going to be the last place on Earth to hold out against the kinds of changes that hopefully somebody out there is going to be initiating. Whether it's China, whether it's somebody else, it's totally unpredictable. I don't know. But whatever it is, it may be that the United States is the last place on Earth to go. It may be that there's some massive turn of events in the United States and it becomes, the vanguard of the global proletariat. Very unlikely for class reasons. Just first world proletariat and the third world proletariat, not very well connected, don't share very similar conditions. In any case, thanks for listening to this video. And I have two videos coming up soon. One is on the G7 announcement that the US and its allies are going to start working on shutting down China's Belt and Road project, possibly with a competitor project. This should be interesting. And also a COVID-19 update. Long story short on COVID, go check out the vaccination rates by state. Just look it up. Vaccination rates by state. Many of the southern U.S. states are like 35% vaccinated. Nobody's wearing masks or distancing anymore. You get one virulent strain racing around the South, it's done. And then suddenly the CDC and everybody has to backtrack. I kind of think it's a matter of time only before that happens. And then what'll happen? Will they cover it honestly? Well, we'll go into this in a future video. Right now, thanks to the patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. There's links to all of that and our other social media in the description. Take care, and we will catch you next time.